Hello, my name is Jeff Lisa Simpson, or JL for short. Welcome to this brief presentation that seeks to explore the many areas of growth and transformation I've experienced throughout my CTS journey. Hopefully, the following slides reveal not only how I have been enriched and impacted academically, but also demonstrate the emotional and even physical transformations I've experienced alongside of and because of my time here at CTS. That's me there, the Jeff part of me, at orientation weekend back in 2014. I arrived at CTS with a religious background that included a fundamentalist Assembly of God childhood, a vast Lutheran experience, and more recently, membership in my local Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches congregation. While not academically astute in areas of theology, I understood well the oppressive nature of Western Christianity. It was time, however, that I needed to respond to what I recognize as a lifelong call to ministerial leadership. But there was more I brought to this seminary experience. I identified in those days as a gay male. Having lived through the 80s and 90s, in that identity, I fully understood where anti-queer bias had its roots: organized religion. I answered that oppression with years of LGBTQ activism, including community organizing, political activism, and even leading gay and Christian seminars. I invite you to look through the artifacts in my second canvas ePortfolio, as they are related to that activism, and you can find that link here on the slide. Nonetheless, it was time to expand my theological knowledge as I prepared to live out my call to ordination. Of course, CTS has shown me exactly how little theological knowledge I had prior to my arrival here. When I look at this photo of the beautiful altar prepared for the closing moments of the 2014 orientation weekend, I am reminded of how I arrived at CTS with limited colors of sand. The articles you will be asked to review in my portfolio are indicative of my successful accomplishments related to the CTS learning objectives, but they are really but a sample of all that defines my experience and my abilities that comprise my time here at CTS. And indeed, they fall short in describing the multiplicity of sand colors that have since filled my vase. That can be attributed to my undertakings here at CTS. The slides to follow serve to enlighten my review team on the vast knowledge I've accumulated, all that I have been throughout this time, the things that I'm doing, and the directions I may be going after this, to explain how those grains of sand have flourished into a colorful spectrum of diversity. Let us begin with the knowing part of this journey. The Scriptures. My initial coursework taught me the significance and the beauty of Scripture when challenged through the use of particular hermeneutics. Exposed to the text through the lens of Judaism, feminism, womanism, queer, and eco-spiritualism, I found new meaning and implications as I completed my courses exploring the entire Hebrew Bible, the New Testament Gospels, and the Epistles. In doing so, I discovered the rich inspiration that Scripture offers when examined through these various lenses, providing challenges and affirmations along the way. But that knowledge expands beyond the text as I was introduced to the historical Christianity, where I came to appreciate the ancients like Origen, the mystics, and Martin Luther. I was exposed to the processes of systematic theology, particularly enamored by the works of Paul Tillich and Carter Hayward. My academics gave me the foundations to move forward in my ministry, as I was consistently encouraged to move beyond the single story into a compassionate embrace of the marginalized. You taught me to preach, theologically based impromptu, prophetically, and even prepared me to eulogize my childhood idol, Daffy Duck, a character who early on taught me the trials of living as a duck in a rabbit's world. Through CTS, I learned to love liturgical worship as I became a ritual geek, while simultaneously learning how I might combine my Native American heritage into Christian liturgical worship. But I was quick to recognize that CTS is about more than teaching and preaching. In my academic work, I was given the opportunity to become immersed in the social justice work that has come to define this institution. The work of racial justice, interreligious engagement, queer studies, and the application and environmental concern through an eco-spiritual formation. Racial justice. Through the brilliance of CTS faculty, I engaged with theologians and activists such as James Cone and Dolores Williams, and honed in on my prior skills in counseling to develop new skills, focusing in on the oppressed by way of the magnificent Dr. Lee Butler. I expanded on this through my clinical pastoral education under the supervision of Reverend Dr. Danielle B. Hurrell, and through the powerfully impactful Chicago walking tour, where I was exposed to successful faith-based operations throughout the city, dedicated to alleviating the pains of racial injustice. I also enrolled in the Southern Justice at the Intersection study tour, where the academic portion has been completed and the tour will be done virtually in May. Interreligious engagement became incredibly important to me as I was in conversations with Jewish rabbis, including Dr. Mikva and local Rabbi Henry Karp. Following a course aimed at dismantling Islamophobia, I became a member of the Interreligious Institute anti-Muslim bias cohort, attended Riot Con, heeded the call of Lisa Zook, and local imam Lisa Killinger. I was exposed in greater immersion to my Native American spiritual heritage as I learned from George Tinker and especially from my CTS beloved Lynn Young. And I remained tuned into the mystic spiritualism that has always resonated with me within my own spiritual journey. Of course, it is in the area of my CTS concentration where my greatest opportunity to learn formulated. My academics has led me to be in conversation with Dr. Stone, Dr. Hornsby, Dr. Justin Sabiatanis, the Reverend Dr. Cody Sanders, Dr. W. Scott Haldeman, Dr. J. Michelson, Dr. Mark Jordan, Reverend Nadia Bowles-Weber, Dr. Michelle Foucault, Dr. Marcella Authas-Reed, Reverend Dr. Carter Hayward, the late Dr. Theodore Jennings, Dr. Lynn-Marine Tonstad, and of course, the leaders from the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. I became particularly immersed in the works of Carter Hayward and dreamed of an inclusive ministry modeled in the style after Nadia Bowles-Weber. My academics and my work for the queer and HIV community landed me recognition in 2020 as a Gilberto Castañeda Scholar, an honor I will forever hold dear. In more recent times, I've opened up to the possibility of incorporating an environmental component to my ministry. I have fallen in love with that proposal as I have studied under Dr. Stone and found favorites in Leonardo Boff and Robert Shore Goss. The Chicago Walking Tour exposed me to community gardens, vocational training programs, and at home I am blessed to know and work with Chad Bagracki, famous for working with living lands and waters along the Mississippi River. As I look forward to my call in pastoral ministry, I'm excited to further my work in the eco-spiritual realm as I hope to create a future free from human dominance and the destruction of all that is created. I think it's important here as we move from the knowing into the being part of my CTS journey to recognize that, similar to CTS impacting my scholarly transformations, so it also created spaces for me to transcend into the most significant periods of personal development in my entire lifetime. I entered this program identifying as a gay male, and with the assistance of many at CTS, I discovered some realities about myself, including my own gender truth. Additionally, as a nearly 30-year survivor of HIV, I was forced to reconcile with some unanticipated health issues in the middle of my program, causing me a few setbacks academically and personally. Nonetheless, I came out on the other side inspired by my truth, by the way my HIV troubles were beneficial as I halted others in another pandemic, and in how I came to recognize my greatest strengths in those matters. My resilience. My resilience to not only survive, but to come out of the fire better and stronger and more equipped than ever to pursue a career in pastoral leadership. Also incorporated into the being section is my living into the commitments inspired by my academics. You will notice only one artifact from the commitments course, but here it becomes apparent that I have lived into much more than that while at CTS. I participated in the Chicago Walking Tour, the weekend retreat in New Buffalo, Michigan, RiotCom, the anti-Muslim bias cohort, several Wednesday noon CTS reflections, the Justice at the Intersection study tour, and most recently I was awarded the Rabbi Herman Schallman Award for Interreligious Leadership Excellence. With that award, I have planned and proposed to create and implement an interreligious event focused on eliminating the trans hostilities in my hometown metro area, working with the interfaith community of my hometown. A major component of the being experience at CTS arrives with the requirement of a field experience. I specifically want to lift up the successful learning experience afforded me as I completed my theological field education at MCC QC. Upon entering this internship with a set of compiled learning goals, I was warned that my objectives there were a little bit ambitious. However, I was able to meet 90% of those objectives and began work on those that I was unable to complete, despite my internship being further complicated with the arrival of a global pandemic. Through both pre and during pandemic, I was able to preach, to begin an adult education forum, to establish a counseling center, serve on several committees in the community that perform social justice work, conduct several new members classes, work to better the administrative operations, and even host a political forum for both city elections and a presidential candidate forum. I've uploaded several artifacts from my theological field education in my ePortfolio, and I ask that you review those artifacts and engage them specifically. To complement my theological field education, I was able to complete my clinical pastoral education at a local UCC congregation after the pandemic limited community opportunities. This turned out to be a very rewarding experience as I served as pulpit supply on several occasions, worked closely with the church's care team, and it was in this capacity where I began to discover my pastoral authority within a congregation of people who were very homogeneous and much less diverse than the folks at MCCQC. Finally, my Chicago Theological Seminary being experience culminated in my proudest academic work while at seminary, my constructive theology. It was in this work that I had conversations primarily with queer and womanist theologians. I conducted interviews in the community and throughout the nation with people to get some data collected upon which to base my constructive theology. I face challenges. I challenge the traditional views on gender, sexuality, and marriage, including the sinful aspects of sexuality. Was challenged by combating typical universal fellowship of metropolitan community churches tradition and their resistance to become more inclusive. My objective in that theology construct was to create more sacred spaces for the non-heteronormative queer and non-queer individuals, as well as revitalizing and perhaps saving my denomination. I hope to expand on this constructive theology in the future to build upon it and move it forward into a praxis. The previous slides represented all that has led me into my current present of doing, taking from my seminary work and forming applicable constructs where it will serve my church and my community. I remain thoroughly engaged in concrete action through my interfaith affiliations and my work in trans activism. Combining both these locations of engagement and endeavors will present itself in practice this fall once again as I plan to create and implement an all-day summit using an interfaith perspective to address the needs for safer and more celebratory experiences for our local trans community. I remain very involved in pastoral work at MCCQC, focusing especially on these ministerial tasks. I continue with my spiritual counseling center. I preach. I've done worship design and leading worship. I have developed rituals and even taught ritual. I have several adult education forums in the beginning stages and plan to open more as time goes on. I participate in the strategic planning for this church. I have been called to help better the administrative aspects of the church, and of course I continue to do pastoral care with members of this congregation and the community at large. My current work moves beyond my work with my own church and my community as I continue to be a resource for other local churches. At Edwards United Church of Christ in Davenport, I continue to lead Bible studies, create workshops and presentations, provide pastoral care, and participate in programs where the members of that church and my own church come together to learn and act. I have been selected as pulpit supply for Hope United Church of Christ in Moline, Illinois. Both these UCC congregations are mostly white, older, and heterosexual in their makeup, so my being an influence reflects my passion to bring the traditional into the fight for equality and justice. I've discussed the knowing, the being, and the doing related to my seminary journey, but I must take this moment to explain the going part of my calling. I have been called as an associate pastor for the Metropolitan Community Church of the Quad Cities, where I plan to be ordained upon completing the final fulfillments required by my denomination. In that role, I will be involved in caring for and expanding the membership, forming educational forums and programming, pastoral counseling, leading worship and preaching, revitalizing this congregation using my administrative and organizational skills, many of which I've developed in my past professional life and through my earning a Master's of Business Administration prior to arriving at CTS. It's often difficult to plan a future by mapping it out with specific details, but I list here some of those things that I hope to pursue beyond this immediate future. I envision planning a church in the Chicago suburbs. I have quite an interest in teaching at churches and even community colleges. I believe my calling includes public and prophetic preaching. I have plans to author a set of books after being encouraged to do so by CTS faculty, peers, friends, and local leaders. And my passion for the political informs me that I must never rule out holding political office, where I would use my seminary experience to guide me in whatever that may look like. As you review my portfolio artifacts and think about this presentation, I hope you will recognize the many ways in which I've grown and developed over the past 7 years. I have learned academically. I have faced the challenges of a disabling disease. I have not only learned about oppression from a distance, but have and continue to experience bias in several forms. I have fulfilled the requirements of this degree program with diligence, being honored in several ways. And as this slide finale indicates, yep, that's me today as Jeff Lisa J.L. Simpson. It indicates that I have literally come through these fires in virtual ferocity, even through a physical and identity transformation. All this, in my opinion, represents a person who is smart, compassionate, focused, determined, and incredibly resilient. I need to thank you for this incredible journey and for all that you have given me.